The final battlefield. Smoke curled through the shattered remains of what was once a mighty alien warship. The battlefield was no longer a place of conquest, but a graveyard of fallen machines and broken warriors. Among the wreckage, a lone figure lay on the scorched ground, his body battered, his armor cracked. Supreme Warlord Voktal, leader of the feared Drakthar raiders, had fallen. His once proud crimson battle armor was scorched and torn, the golden insignia of his people barely visible beneath layers of ash and blood. His twin hearts pounded weakly as he gasped for breath, struggling to make sense of the unthinkable. How could this have happened? He had led invasions across a dozen worlds. He had never lost. His warriors were the finest in the galaxy, trained from birth to conquer and dominate. No species had ever stopped them. But here he was, defeated. The air around him was thick with the scent of burning metal and plasma residue. The once mighty Drakthar fleet, an armada feared across the stars, lay in ruins. Their warships, built to be unstoppable, had been torn apart like paper. And it was because of them. The humans. Voktal clenched his jaw, his mandibles twitching with fury and disbelief. They were supposed to be weak. That's what the intelligence reports had said. That's what every other empire in the galaxy had believed. Humanity was an isolated, war-torn, technologically inferior species, unworthy of the stars. They should have fallen within days. Instead, they had done the impossible. Memories of a lost war. As his vision blurred, memories of the battle flooded his mind. It had begun like any other invasion. The Drakthar fleet had arrived at Earth's doorstep, prepared to crush resistance within hours. Their first wave had targeted major cities, their firepower erasing entire districts in moments. But instead of chaos and surrender, they had been met with something different: human defiance. At first, it was amusing. A species fighting back against an enemy they could never hope to defeat. But then, something changed. Human soldiers had fought like no warriors Voktal had ever seen. They were not the strongest. They were not the fastest. But they were relentless. They refused to break. Where other species had surrendered, humans adapted. They used guerrilla tactics, sabotage, cyber warfare. They fought not just with weapons, but with their minds. Tricking, luring, outmaneuvering. Entire Drakthar battalions disappeared in the night, wiped out by hidden traps and ambushes. Warships were hacked and hijacked, their own weapons turned against them. It was unnatural. It was terrifying. Voktal had laughed at first. He had thought it was luck, a brief resistance that would soon collapse. But it never did. Humanity did not break. And as the weeks turned into months, the Drakthar stopped laughing. The last stand. His vision flickered. The pain in his chest grew stronger. His body was shutting down. Footsteps echoed through the wreckage. Heavy, deliberate, human footsteps. Voktal tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey. He could only lie there as the shadow of a figure appeared above him, a human soldier. The man was clad in Earth's advanced battle armor, the UNS insignia stamped on his shoulder. His helmet's visor reflected the dim glow of firelight, masking his face. He carried his rifle lowered, but there was no mistaking the tension in his stance. Voktal had seen that stance before. It was the stance of a warrior expecting one last fight. The human studied him for a moment before speaking. His voice was calm, almost emotionless. So, this is how the great Voktal falls. The warlord gritted his teeth. He should have responded with a challenge, a final threat. He should have told the human that the Drakthar would rise again, that their revenge would be swift and merciless. But he couldn't, because he knew it wasn't true. The Drakthar were finished. Their fleet was gone. Their warriors were dead. And Earth still stood. The last words of a conqueror. Voktal's breaths grew shallow. His vision darkened at the edges. His time was almost up. For the first time in his life, he felt something foreign, something he had never known before. Regret. Not because he had lost, but because he had been wrong. He had called humanity weak. He had believed them to be easy prey. And now, as he lay dying on the very battlefield he had sought to conquer, he saw the truth. His mandibles trembled as he forced out his final words. Humanity cannot be defeated. The human soldier stood still for a long moment, as if absorbing the weight of those words. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving Voktal alone beneath the burning sky. The warlord exhaled one last time, his final breath. The galaxy had underestimated humanity, and now they would never make that mistake again. The underestimation of humanity. Months before the fall of the Drakthar, before the wreckage, the flames, and the whispered last words of Supreme Warlord Voktal, there was confidence. No, not just confidence, arrogance. The Drakthar Empire had never lost a war. Their warriors were trained from birth, their ships were forged with the strongest alloys, and their fleets had crushed civilizations twice as advanced as Earth. When their spies first reported on humanity, the warlords laughed. Primitive, divided, weak. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a species constantly fighting itself, a species that had only recently discovered faster than light travel, a species too fragile to survive against the might of the Drakthar. Voktal himself had stood before the High Council of Raiders and delivered his verdict with absolute certainty. Earth will fall in days. The fleet was dispatched. The war had begun. And yet, nothing went as planned. The first strike. A fatal miscalculation. The Drakthar fleet entered Earth's orbit without resistance. No planetary shields, no massive defense systems, just a scattering of orbital satellites and a few small warships that looked laughably outdated. Voktal smirked as he watched the battle unfold from the command deck of his war cruiser. His second-in-command, a cold and efficient warrior named Rolthak, observed the incoming reports with ease. They are exactly as we expected. Disorganized. Weak. The first bombardment began. Cities burned. Communication networks collapsed. Entire regions were wiped from existence. And yet, something felt off. Voktal couldn't shake the feeling. He had conquered dozens of worlds, and by now, he should have received the first wave of surrender transmissions, pleas for mercy, desperate negotiations, offers of submission. But there was only silence. And then the first human counterattack came. The phantom resistance. At first, it was nothing. Small explosions in supply depots, minor disruptions to energy grids, a few intercepted communication lines. Nothing that worried the Drakthar. But then one of their forward bases went dark. Voktal had ordered his warriors to investigate. The squadron that was sent never returned. Then, another outpost fell silent. Then a supply convoy disappeared. Then a battleship exploded from an unknown detonation inside its hull. One after another, the Drakthar began losing ground. But how? They had superior weapons, superior numbers, superior warships. And yet, the humans were not fighting like any enemy they had ever faced. Warriors without chains. The Drakthar followed rules. They fought with honor. They believed in dominance through brute force and discipline. Humans did not. They'd fought like ghosts, striking from the shadows, ambushing from the ruins of their fallen cities. They did not fight for glory. They fought to win. They hacked into Drakthar command channels, rewrote orders, and tricked entire battalions into marching into traps. They used their own weakness against them. The destruction of their cities only fueled their rage. Every loss made them fight harder. A captured Drakthar commander, before his execution, had been asked what it was like to fight against humans. His answer was chilling. They do not stop. They do not retreat. They do not break. Voktal refused to believe it. He doubled the war effort. He ordered the greatest warriors of the Empire to lead the charge. But the more he tried to crush Earth, the harder it fought back. And deep down, for the first time in his life, he felt something foreign. Doubt. The war becomes a nightmare. Reports flooded in. Drakthar warships disappearing without explanation. Supply lines sabotaged by resistance fighters operating deep in enemy territory. Elite warriors ambushed and slaughtered by soldiers, fighting with nothing but desperation and fury. Voktal's fleets were stronger, but human tactics were smarter. His soldiers were fierce, but human soldiers were merciless. And then the real horror began. Human scientists had been watching, waiting, studying, and now they had adapted. The breaking point. 6 months into the invasion, Earth deployed its greatest secret weapon. Not a ship, not a superweapon, but a strategy. Humanity stopped fighting defensively. They stopped hiding. They went on the offensive. And for the first time in his long, blood-soaked career, Supreme Warlord Voktal understood fear. His greatest mistake had not been attacking Earth. His greatest mistake had been underestimating humans. The war had changed, and soon it would end. But not the way he had expected. The impossible resistance. Supreme Warlord Voktal sat in the command chamber of his war cruiser, watching the impossible unfold before his very eyes. The holographic battlefield map displayed chaos. The once perfect formation of the Drakthar fleet was fractured, their supply routes severed, and their most secure outposts destroyed from within. This was not how the invasion was supposed to go. Earth was meant to fall in days, not fight for months, not turn the war against them. But somehow, humanity had done the impossible. Voktal's claws curled against the armrest of his command chair, his rage barely contained. He had underestimated these creatures. They should have been weak. Instead, they had become the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced. The death of a war machine. The Drakthar Empire had perfected the art of conquest. They had crushed countless civilizations, each one falling faster than the last. Their warriors were fierce, disciplined, unstoppable. Their warships were impenetrable, designed to dominate any battlefield. And yet, humanity had adapted. First, they learned how to fight Drakthar warriors. They had no genetic advantages, no claws, no armored skin, no enhanced muscles. And yet, their ingenuity turned every battle into a trap. They used terrain, explosives, and ambushes to eliminate entire squads before they could react. They learned Drakthar weaknesses faster than any species before them. Voktal had ordered his best warriors to counter this resistance, to wipe out the humans before they became a threat. But the humans were already a threat. Then they learned how to fight Drakthar warships. They hacked communications, scrambled navigation systems, and hijacked command relays. They launched stealth raids, striking key locations that left massive battleships drifting powerless in space. They didn't fight for honor. They fought to win. No species had ever been so ruthless, so relentless, so completely unwilling to accept defeat. The unthinkable happens. One night, Voktal was woken by alarms. A group of human resistance fighters had infiltrated one of his most secure warships. Impossible. Every ship in his fleet was protected by biometric security, surveillance drones, and automated defense systems. And yet, when he arrived on the bridge, his officers were dead, his elite guards slaughtered. And on the main command console, a message had been left, one written in a language he had once considered primitive. You are not the hunter. You are the prey. The breaking point. Voktal's fury was unmatched. The Drakthar fleet still had the advantage in numbers. They still had superior weapons. But the humans were not fighting a war of numbers or weapons. They were fighting a war of survival. And survival breeds desperation. Desperation breeds innovation. Innovation breeds victory. The final battle was approaching. Voktal could feel it. He could see it in the desperate movements of his fleets, the hesitation in his officers, the uncertainty in his warriors. The Drakthar had never feared anything before. Now, they feared humans. The fall begins. One last report came through Voktal's personal terminal. Earth's forces had launched their final counteroffensive. Human warships, newly upgraded with stolen Drakthar technology, had engaged the invasion fleet. Cities once burned were now fortified war zones, ready to lure in and crush any remaining enemy forces. And humanity was no longer defending. They were attacking. Voktal's breathing slowed. His claws tightened. He had thought this war would be another victory, another step toward universal domination. Instead, he had awakened something terrible. And in the back of his mind, a single horrifying realization took root. We cannot win. The war was about to end. And for the first time in his life, Voktal knew defeat was inevitable. The turning point. The stars above Earth had once been filled with the unstoppable might of the Drakthar fleet. Now, they were filled with wreckage. Burning warships drifted in the void, their shattered hulls silent testaments to a war that was no longer theirs to win. From his war cruiser, Supreme Warlord Voktal watched as the impossible became reality. His invasion, once seen as a mere formality, had turned into a nightmare. And the nightmare was getting worse. The hunters become the hunted. Voktal had spent his life crushing civilizations. His fleet had burned cities, enslaved entire species, and reduced planets to nothing but silence. But humans did not stay silent. They studied, they adapted, they changed, and now they were on the offensive. The war changes overnight. For months, the Drakthar had been chasing human resistance fighters across Earth, hunting them down in ruined cities and darkened jungles. Now, the roles had reversed. Voktal slammed his fist against the console. Human strike teams were breaching Drakthar fortresses, sabotaging key outposts. Drakthar warships were mysteriously exploding, their own weapons turned against them. Entire battalions were going missing, lured into traps they could never escape from. Voktal slammed his fist against the console. This was not how war was fought. The humans had no honor. They did not follow the rules of conquest. And that was the terrifying part. They didn't fight for glory, for power, for dominance. They fought to win. The final mistake. Voktal's advisors begged him to fall back, to regroup, to reconsider. The Supreme Warlord refused. His ego was too great. His belief in Drakthar's supremacy was absolute. He gave one last order, a full-scale planetary assault. If he could not win with strategy, he would win with brute force. Every remaining Drakthar warship descended toward Earth, their cannons aimed at the last human strongholds. It was meant to be the final battle, the end of humanity. Instead, it was humanity's trap, Earth's hidden weapon. As the Drakthar fleet moved into attack formation, something shifted. A ripple in space, a sudden, strange gravitational pull. Then, Earth's secret weapon revealed itself. A fleet of human warships emerged from the dark void beyond the moon. But they were not the same outdated vessels that had faced the Drakthar months ago. They had been rebuilt, reinvented, enhanced. Using captured Drakthar technology, human engineers had created something new, something more powerful than anything the galaxy had ever seen. And they were ready to strike. The first shot. For a single moment, the battlefield was silent. Then, a single human warship fired. A beam of concentrated energy ripped through the lead Drakthar battleship. A ship that should have survived anything was erased in an instant. And then, all hell broke loose. The fall of the Drakthar. Drakthar warships exploded one after another, caught in the perfectly calculated attack patterns of humanity's new fleet. Human fighters outmaneuvered enemy cruisers, striking at weak points the Drakthar didn't even know they had. Earth's defenses activated, deploying weapons that hadn't existed 6 months ago. The unstoppable Drakthar had finally met something stronger. For the first time, they were the ones running. Voktal's moment of truth. On the war cruiser's bridge, Voktal stared at the battlefield, unblinking. His warriors, once unbreakable, were now begging for retreat orders. His fleet, once mighty, was being torn apart. This was it, The moment he had never prepared for. Defeat. The war had ended, and humanity had won. Voktal exhaled slowly. He had always thought of humans as insignificant, weak. Now, as his ship's alarms blared and his officers cried out in fear, he understood something terrible. He had never faced an enemy like this, and he never would again. The fall of the raiders. The war was no longer a battle. It was a massacre. The once mighty Drakthar fleet, which had arrived in Earth's orbit with unstoppable arrogance, was now scattered and broken. Fire-consumed warships, their hulls splitting apart in violent explosions. Desperate distress signals filled the galactic channels, but no reinforcements would come. Drakthar warriors, once feared across the stars, now found themselves hunted, fighting for their very survival. Supreme Warlord Voktal stood in the middle of the chaos, his blood-soaked armor a grim reflection of his crumbling empire. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be on the losing side. The death of an empire. The Drakthar had always been conquerors. They had crushed civilizations, burned entire planets, and taken victory as their birthright. But this time, they had met something stronger. Not stronger in size, not stronger in weapons, stronger in will. Humanity's final push. Voktal turned his gaze to the battlefield. The last of his forces had been forced into a final stand. A few dozen warships remained, their defenses failing, their escape routes cut off. On the ground, his warriors, Drakthar champions, elite soldiers trained for 100 wars, had been surrounded by human troops. And the worst part, the humans were not offering surrender. No speeches, no negotiations. They were here to finish what had been started. The trap closes. Voktal's ship shook violently as another blast from a human warship ripped through its shields. Supreme Warlord, his second-in-command, gasped, his voice laced with panic. "We need to retreat. There's still a chance." Voktal already knew the truth. There was no retreat. Human forces had been watching and waiting for this moment. The Drakthar escape routes were cut off. Their supply lines had been sabotaged. The enemy had let them think they had a chance, until now. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The final stand of the warlord. Alarms blared. The warship's power systems flickered. The bridge was filled with the scent of burning circuits and fear. Voktal clenched his fists. He had spent his life believing in strength. He had mocked weakness, crushed resistance, and laughed at the defeated. And now he was the one being laughed at. His legacy would be one of failure. Unless he went down fighting. One last charge. With a roar, Voktal ripped the battle-scarred Drakthar banner from its place and strode toward the escape bay. If he was to die, it would be with a blade in his hand. If his empire was to fall, it would be on a battlefield, not in the cold void of space. If humanity had truly won, they would have to kill him with their own hands. As he stepped onto the surface of Earth, surrounded by human warriors who had no fear, he felt something he had never felt before. Respect. These humans, these creatures he had once dismissed as weak, had earned their victory. And now he would face them. With a deep breath, Voktal raised his warblade and let out one last battle cry. The humans did not hesitate. The last warlord of the Drakthar fell beneath the unstoppable force of humanity. And with him, the Drakthar Empire died. The raiders' last words. The battlefield was quiet now. The gunfire had stopped. The screams had faded. The sky, once filled with the burning wreckage of Drakthar warships, was now clear, save for the distant glow of Earth's defensive satellites. The war was over, and humanity had won. Supreme Warlord Voktal, the conqueror of 100 worlds, the terror of the galactic frontier, lay broken on the battlefield, his body pinned beneath the weight of his own arrogance. His warblade, once feared across the stars, lay shattered beside him. His warriors, once unshakable in their loyalty, were gone. There was nothing left. Nothing but the truth. A dying warlord's realization. A shadow fell over him. Through his failing vision, he saw a human soldier standing above him, clad in battle-worn armor, rifle lowered. The human did not look at him with hatred. He did not look at him with mercy. He simply waited. Voktal let out a shaky breath, feeling his twin hearts slow. He had never thought he would die like this. On a battlefield, surrounded not by his own warriors, but by his enemy. His own arrogance had brought him here. His own blindness had sealed his fate. The Drakthar had ruled with brute strength, with fear, with raw dominance. But humanity was something different. They did not rule through fear. They did not dominate through strength alone. They endured. They survived when they should have perished. They fought when they should have surrendered. And in doing so, they had become unstoppable. Voktal coughed, the taste of blood thick in his mouth. His voice was weak, but the words that came from his lips carried the weight of an empire's failure. We were fools to challenge you. The human soldier remained silent, his grip tightening on his weapon. He wanted to hear it. Voktal exhaled slowly, the last traces of his pride slipping away. Humanity, he rasped, cannot be defeated. A long silence followed. The words, once unthinkable, now echoed through the battlefield, carried away by the wind. And then, with a final breath, the warlord was gone. The weight of victory. The human soldier remained standing over him, unmoving, listening to the final whispers of a dying empire. Around him, the surviving human forces lowered their weapons. The war had ended, but none of them cheered. This was not a victory to be celebrated. This was a war that should have never been fought. Humanity had not just survived. They had proven something far greater. They had forced the galaxy to acknowledge their strength. The broadcast that shook the stars. Hours later, a single message was transmitted across the galaxy, sent by human command, but carrying the last words of their fallen enemy. It played across alien-controlled worlds, inside the chambers of the Galactic Council, and in the strongholds of rival empires who had once considered Earth insignificant. The message was simple, a recording of Supreme Warlord Voktal's final breath. Humanity cannot be defeated. For the first time in history, the stars were silent. And in that silence, the galaxy finally understood. Humanity was no longer prey. They were no longer a backwater species, ignored and dismissed. They were a force to be feared. And those who had once mocked them would never make that mistake again. The legend of humanity. The war was over. The Drakthar, once the most feared raiders in the galaxy, had been defeated, not just in battle, but in spirit. Their fleets lay in ruins, their warriors scattered or dead, their supreme warlord silent forever. But it wasn't just the end of a war. It was the beginning of something far greater. A new legend had been born, and its name was humanity. The fear spreads across the stars. The last recorded words of Supreme Warlord Voktal, his dying confession, his acceptance of an unthinkable truth, spread across the galaxy like a wildfire. Humanity cannot be defeated. Those 5 words shook empires to their core. In the grand halls of the Galactic Council, alien diplomats argued in frantic whispers. Nations that had once mocked Earth now feared them. In the darkened command centers of rival warlords, battle plans were silently erased. Invasions against Earth were quietly abandoned. Across the distant colonies of the stars, rulers who once saw humans as insignificant now saw them as something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something unkillable. The surviving Drakthar's shame. The Drakthar survivors returned to their homeworld in disgrace. Once, they had been the predators of the void, the unstoppable force of conquest. Now, they were hunted, feared, shamed. In their own war halls, their leaders listened to the final message of their fallen warlord, played back before the entire council. Humanity cannot be defeated. They had once laughed at Earth. Now, they feared its shadow. For the first time in Drakthar history, an order was given that had never been spoken before. We do not wage war against Earth again. Not because of treaties, not because of alliances, but because they knew they would lose. A warning to the universe. From the ashes of battle, Earth emerged unchallenged. Humanity had not just won a war. They had rewritten the rules of the galaxy. The message was clear. Do not underestimate them. Do not provoke them. Do not test their strength. Because if you do, you will not survive. The final transmission from Earth. As the last of the human warships withdrew from the battlefield, a single transmission was sent out from Earth's high command, broadcast across every known empire. It was short, simple, and utterly terrifying. We are humanity, and we are watching. The new galactic order. The stars would never be the same again. Where once humans were ignored, now they were spoken of in whispers. Where once they were seen as weak, now they were seen as the storm that had crushed the mighty Drakthar. And far beyond the borders of the known universe, hidden warlords, rival empires, and unseen threats watched Earth in silence. Some saw an opportunity. Others saw a challenge. But all of them saw the same thing. The rise of a species that would never be conquered. The rise of a new legend. The rise of humanity.